I'm doing great.
So I started asking you some questions, and it was really interesting, and I realized I know nothing about it. And one of the things that was really interesting is that you said that you also similarly knew little about the depth of the information you're talking about now.
Yeah, I've really learned everything.
Experience.
Yeah, everything that I know about whales I've learned in the past 2.5 years. When I worked at SeaWorld, I really didn't know anything about whales. I mean, I knew surface anatomy. I knew what they told me to tell the public about whales, but I really didn't know anything. And everything that I know I've learned in the past 2.5 years.
So, I mean, actually what's really cool about that is that first of all, it says something about how much these educators know as they're educating the public. So how much is education really there? And two, that anyone like you can go out and actually just get motivated about learning about this and find out. So, you know, wow,
well, the education piece is really interesting because that's part of the permit, part of the permit that's that NOAA is going to issue or not for these whales. Part of the permitting process says that these whales have to go to a facility that's going to be involved in research and education. And so the Georgia Aquarium and SeaWorld and the Shedd Aquarium all make a big deal that they have this amazing educational program for the public, and that's what these animals are going to be there for. They're ambassadors for their kind, and that people wouldn't love these animals if they didn't see them in person. And so Dr. Lori Marino, who's a scientist who's been researching the intelligence of whales and dolphins for years, she was one of the speakers at the hearing on Friday, October 12th in Maryland, and she spoke to the educational piece about what these marine parks and aquariums are calling education isn't necessarily educational. That what it appears to be what they're teaching, even though they're saying they're teaching about animal behavior, they're actually teaching people about the husbandry behaviors that they do to keep the animals healthy. And so that just because the aquarium says that they're teaching, that they have an educational program, doesn't mean that anybody's walking out with real knowledge. It doesn't necessarily, just because they say we're doing an educational program doesn't mean people are actually getting educated. How do you actually prove that? And then the other piece that she pointed out is that the aquariums will often say, well, you know, if people don't actually experience these animals in person, then they won't love them and they won't care about them. And that's, I mean, they often bring that one out, and the easiest thing to say is, well, kids all over the world love dinosaurs. What kid has ever seen a dinosaur? But they love them and they care about them and they know everything about them. So you can debunk that one really easily.
What other theories were debunked by, I mean, you had said earlier, what was it, 28 in favor of the permit and 15 testified?
Well, no, there was about 80 to 100 people there.
Okay.
And actually, as an aside, that's kind of interesting because the industry, the Georgia Aquarium, we don't actually know who yet, hired line sitters to stand outside the permitting office at NOAA at 5 o'clock in the morning.
How do you know that?
Because they told us. There were people online who looked, I mean, I hate to say this, but they looked like homeless people, just standing out in line. Some of them were temps, they were professional line sitters, and as throughout the morning, they would be replaced with industry people. And the idea was that so that the industry people could speak first and they would get the better spots, or if there weren't enough spots, that the room would be filled with industry people. That ended up actually backfiring because I talked to one person in there who told me that she was hired by a temp agency to be there, but another person told me that there was a person who was hired by the temp agency who was there and got so fascinated with the proceedings that she ended up staying, and she was planning on writing a letter to NOAA in support of them not issuing the permit. So, and also because of the sort of the makeup of the room, it actually looked like there were more people there who were against the permit than in support of the permit. So that was really interesting. But in terms of who spoke, there 28 people actually spoke for the public hearing portion, and 13 people spoke in favor of the permit being issued, and 15 people spoke against. What's interesting about that is of the 13 people that spoke, all of them were industry people. They were people from the Georgia Aquarium, they were veterinarians working for the Georgia Aquarium, there were 2 educators who again were speaking to the educational value of what the Georgia Aquarium does, but they weren't actually speaking to the specifics of the permit, whether or not why this permit needs to be denied or why this permit should be issued. They were basically talking about how wonderful, you know, marine parks and aquariums are in general, as though this hearing was an indictment on marine parks and aquariums. And
well, can you talk a little bit about the permit itself?
Yeah.
So 1993 was the last one, and what are the specifics that we should be concerned about?
Last time last time the U.S. attempted to import animals from wild animals into the U.S. was in 1993. So, and back in 1993 there was a huge public uproar, and basically they were embarrassed into not doing this again. And now, and so
why? What were the permit details?
I don't know the specifics on that one. I just know that it was a long time ago, and now the Georgia Aquarium has put in this permit to get 18 wild-caught beluga whales from Russia. I think it's the Sea of Oshtok is where they're coming from. But it's not just the Georgia Aquarium. What's interesting is that the Georgia Aquarium they are listed on the permit, but out of the 18 whales, I think 11 of them are going to the SeaWorld parks and also the Shed Aquarium, and I believe the Mystic Aquarium as well. I'm not sure on that.
So is that part of this whole deal? So you get a permit to get a wild captured and transport it into a captivity situation, and from there, are they allowed to just transport as they wish, like a piece of property?
That's also very interesting. And again, I'm still learning all this, so excuse me. Dr. Naomi Rose from the Humane Society of the U.S. can probably correct me if I make a mistake, and I hope that she will. But so my understanding is what happened. These whales were captured dating back to 2006. And they were, and at the time the Georgia Aquarium did not have a permit, but they committed approximately $2 million of resources towards capturing these whales. And we do not have any video that shows whether or not the capture was humane. So there's no way to, and that's one of the conditions of the permit, and whether or not these animals can be brought into the U.S. is whether or not the capture and then subsequent confinement, whatever situation they're in, that has to be humane. So we have no way of determining that because there is no video footage, at least none that they've shown.
That's one of the permit requirements of the humanity of it. Can you just go into a little bit of that, of why, I mean, I can see that would be the whole public uproar, that would be an easy stance to get upset about. So what constitutes humane towards an animal that's not human?
Well, that's a very good question, and there is video on the internet, and you can watch some of these. I believe Tim Zimmerman from Outside Magazine, if you go to his blog, he's got a WordPress blog, and he's also on Tumblr, and you can go, and he's posted a video of what a beluga capture looks like. And it's incredibly violent. They jump on these animals, they throw nets on top of them. They're supposed to only take animals of a certain age. They're not supposed to just focus on taking young females, which of course the aquariums like young females. But one of the arguments on the anti-permit side was that they could potentially, with the number of animals that they've taken out of this small population, they could potentially devastate a matriline. So they could devastate like a whole layer of the population that could potentially not recover. So there's a lot of issues around what animals they take and how they take them, but because they don't have video from this there were several captures that were done to get these 18 animals, there's no way to verify whether or not the captures were done humanely. I haven't seen, the conditions that they're living under, but apparently they're not good. And then the other piece is that the transport also has to be done so that they're not going to subject the animals to undue stress. And so this was I thought this was one of the most fascinating pieces of the testimony, and a man who he was a pilot and he just retired, and he's the president of the Cetacean Society International. His name's Bill. He got up and he spoke about the logistics of the transfer. And apparently the Georgia Aquarium's, the permit that they wrote really was very vague about what the transfer was going to look like. They claimed that the animals were only going to be moved about 100 feet during this transfer. And actually, I should back up and say that because of the logistics of moving these animals from Russia to the U.S., Russian planes can't land in the U.S. because their noise standards they don't meet the U.S. noise standards. U.S. planes can't land in Russia. We don't know why, but I guess they just don't want them here. They think they're spying or something. So the U.S. planes can't land in Russia. So the transfer has to happen in, I think it's Liège, France. And so what has to happen is the animals are going to fly in on Russian planes. And these planes are loud and noisy, and they'll be in their transport boxes. And then they have to take them out of the plane, take them out of their transport boxes, move them to another transport box, and put them on another plane, and then go from France into the U.S. And so I don't know what the estimate was on the permit, what the actual hour estimate for that whole process to take from point A to point B. But this pilot spoke and he said, look, I've been a commercial pilot for 40 years, and I know from reading this permit that there's no way that you're going to accomplish this in the amount of time that you're allotting for it. You don't even have a contingency plan if something goes wrong. He thought it would take over 40 hours if everything went right, and it could potentially take longer if it ran into some problems.
And you were saying that that's a big stress on the animals, causing an increase in the potential for even death.
Yeah, Dr. Naomi Rose says that she's researched this a lot, and what she's found is that it is the stress of the capture and the stress of the transfer are probably even more stressful for the animals than captivity itself. So that's the period of time where you want to subject them to the least amount of stress that you can. And so based on the conditions that they have to meet, most people were arguing that there's no way they can meet those conditions because they're already being subject to undue stress. So we cannot do, this transfer is illegal, that NOAA actually has to deny the transfer just based on that criteria alone.
What other elements of the permit did you hear about that were like, I love the idea that rather than talk about it in vagary, as opposed to the permit itself, what were some of the conditions other than the transport itself and the educational elements? What else?
Well, those are the major things, and then also just looking at the population. The industry had a scientist speak about he was trying to say that, I mean, he spoke, it was interesting because nobody really could tell when he first got up for the first 2 or 3 minutes what side he was on, because he was basically speaking as though he was addressing a scientific conference, like we would all know the terms that he was using. So there were only a few people in the room that could actually understand that he was trying to make the case that the larger population of Russian beluga whales are all one population, so that they weren't actually decimating the population by taking the belugas from the population that they were taking them from. That was his conclusion, but it didn't really make a lot of sense.
So to anthropomorphize this and make it make sense, are we, when those who say that we would be decimating a piece of the population, especially by choosing to take young females,
right.
Is that akin to looking at humanity at large, breaking it down into a nationality and breaking that down into tribal groups or, areas, countries, so that we would be pulling, like when you say this, I mean, I'm thinking you're saying that you would just decimate a piece of the population of a specific pod.
And you could potentially not recover from that. Like if you took all of the young females of a certain age from the pod, like all the females of a breeding age from the pod, then you're decimated, you lose like a whole, I don't know what the word for it, but you lose like a whole layer of population. I mean, you could potentially just lose the population just because of that. Again, this is not my field, so I don't understand all the genetics behind it, but the Humane Society of the U.S. would argue that yes, in fact, this is a potential danger, and then of course the geneticists on the side of the industry was saying, oh no, they're all actually related, so we're not causing any harm. But what I didn't know is that the Russians are taking at least 22 belugas every year. Some years they're actually taking more. Some of these animals were actually taken in excess of what they should have been taking out of the population. And the truth is that if the U.S. denies this permit, the animals it's not like they're going to be released back into the wild. They'll probably end up going to China. So really one of the reasons why we want to stop this permit is that we want to not have this precedent set that it's okay for the U.S. to go take these animals from the wild and bring, or even if it's happening in another country, we don't want it to happen here. We don't want to condone it here, but we also need to worry about what's happening in countries like China where the marine park industry is booming. And so those animals. So what we need to do is stop those animals from having we need to not have the Russians need to not have a buyer. Right, as long as they have a buyer, they will go and they'll collect these animals. Yeah.
Shut down the market.
Yeah. Exactly.
So what was the element that you brought to testimony? What was it that you
I really showed up as an FC World Trainer. It's the first time an FC World Trainer has gone to one of these hearings and testified. And I just spoke on behalf of the belugas as individuals. Most people were speaking because I'm not a scientist. I have a degree in animal science, but I'm an acupuncturist now. So I have experience working with these animals, and I know what they're like in person. And I've had, just some amazing, incredible experiences of I'm one of the lucky people who has had the opportunity to swim with them. I sat in the bottom of the pool with scuba gear on and had them buzz by me. We used to call them buzzers. They would echolocate on you and you could feel it in your whole body. It was really wild. But I've had that experience, and I've also worked with them, and I've seen the lives that they live, and they're pretty much devoid of stimulus. If you think about beluga whales, don't swim as far as killer whales over the course of a day, but they can swim 60 to 80 miles a day looking for food. Their social structures are, like killer whales, are also very complicated. They can be found in pods of up to 100, and during breeding time, they can even be in groups of over 1,000. So huge numbers. We're confining them in these small blue pools. There's maybe 4 or 5 individuals, so they're not really in their family units that they're used to. The animals are they communicate with echolocation. They're very auditory animals. So putting them in these tiny pools is like putting them, if you or I were confined in a space half this size, and for us it would be like mirrors all over the room, and reflections were just coming back at us all the time. I mean, that causes a huge amount of stress for them. I mean, you can imagine, like, if you, the analogy that I didn't make this analogy at the hearing, but somebody was asking me about, we were having a discussion about how you can tune things out. And so if I was a beluga whale living in a concrete tank, I would eventually start to like find a way. I'd have to tune out that sound. So like you'd sort of have to walk around in a daze. It's like if you grew up in New York City, after a while the background sirens you don't hear them anymore. Like it would take a huge noise to get your attention, whereas if you were in the country and all of a sudden a siren came up, you would be like, whoa, what's that? So the beluga whales must be just inundated with sound all the time, and what does that do to them? It's got to be like, I think about a human who would be subjected to that kind of noise or visual disturbance all the time, or any kind of motion, like if there was some sort of vibration going on, which the animals do feel when there's construction going on in the park. So just imagine what that would do to your nervous system. It's like it's sort of fraying it at the edges, and just constantly day in and day out. And they're forced to perform, anywhere from 3 to 7, sometimes 10 shows a day for dead fish with loud music. Their only interaction really is when trainers step up to the pool and do some sort of interaction with them, a training session, or they jump in the water and they play with them, or they're doing a show. But then after hours, the trainers go home, and from 7 o'clock at night, till 9 o'clock in the morning, they don't really get any attention. And again, they're incredibly social creatures. They must be just incredibly bored.
So on a really personal, just anecdotal, how do you feel about it level, having worked with some of these individuals in captivity, what would your sense, either do you have a story, an anecdote about a particular individual that gives you an overall impression, or do you just have an overall impression of their, say, happiness factor?
Well, it's an interesting thing, because when you're a SeaWorld trainer, I started at SeaWorld when I was just, I don't think I had turned 22 years old yet, and so most people who get hired at SeaWorld, it's their dream to be a SeaWorld trainer. All I wanted to do is jump in the water with the animals. And the first animals I was able to get in the water with were the beluga whales, because they're so gentle. I refer to them as big Pillsbury Doughboys. Beluga whales most people don't know this, but they're not in the dolphin family. They're not related to dolphins and killer whales. They're actually related to narwhals. And so they don't have those same pointy teeth. They have these like little nubbins of teeth. They barely are sticking up out of their gum line. They're like little cylindrical things. And yeah, they sort of like, what's a beluga whale going to do? Gum you to death? So they're really safe. So beginning trainers can get in the water with these animals, and and they're not worried that something's going to happen to you. So those are the first animals that I really got to know. And you start out doing this scuba sequence where you jump in the water with them and you do what they call an underwater ballet. You're basically doing mimic behaviors. And speaking of anthropomorphizing, you're basically like shaking like that, and the beluga mimics you, or you do a spin underwater, or you do somersault and they follow you, and SeaWorld calls those extensions of natural behaviors, which of course they're not. And so you start to get to know individual animals, and there were 4 beluga whales that were at the park when I was there. There was Spooky, Shadow, AJ, and Bandit. Spooky and Shadow were there first, and then AJ and Bandit came in a couple of months later, and each one of them had an individual personality. Spooky was she was just odd. She had this fascination with I think it was like the dumpster to the right of the front show pool. She would hang out there for hours and just stare at this thing. I talked to Naomi Rose from the Humane Society, and she's like, that kind of sounds like a neurotic behavior. And she was sort of a neurotic whale. and then there was Shadow, who was the male whale, and he's about 2,000 pounds. And he was just this like steady, consistent, wonderful animal. He was amazing. We all loved to get in the water with him. We said, basically, if you were having a bad day, you just jump in the water with a beluga whale and you would feel better. And my favorite picture from working at SeaWorld, I have a picture where I'm kissing Shadow, and his melon is pushing over into the side of my face, and I'm like squished into his face. And then AJ and Bandit were a little bit more skittish. They weren't as well trained, so I didn't know them as well. But beluga whales have this sort of ethereal quality to them. They're not like dolphins. They're sort of like, it's hard to explain, but they're just there's just this gentleness about them. But when I think about it now, I only knew them in captivity, so I don't know what they were like in the wild. And so they had a little bit of this distance. Like they weren't really trying to connect in the same way. They were interested in food, but it wasn't the same experience that I'd had, with a killer whale, or working with a killer whale, or with a dolphin. So they were really interesting animals, and they were really fun to be with. But one of the things I said at the hearing is that despite all the amazing experiences I had with them, knowing what I know now about how their lives are in captivity versus what kind of lives they could be living in the wild, I would trade all that experience for a heartbeat, just to have them don't bring any more animals into these pools, and to set the ones free that are or at least put them in some sort of rehab situation in an ocean pen. I would totally give that up.
Is this the final solution? So if this permit did not go through, would you advocate some changes to the permit?
Yeah.
Or advocate a larger change to our whole cultural idea of having animals in captivity that really belong in the wild?
And one thing I didn't say is that all 4 of those whales that I worked with are dead now, by the way. They lived a really short fraction of the lives that they could have lived in the wild. Both Bandit and Spooky had calves. Spooky's calf didn't. I think it was a stillborn. Bandit's calf lived like 4 years. So I think first of all they need to stop breeding these animals in captivity because they don't do very well. Their survivability isn't very high, and that's why they're trying to import these animals right now because the genetic diversity of the population is falling, and they're trying to sort of infuse fresh blood into it. So they're already doing a bad job keeping them alive, and that's why they need to bring more whales in. SeaWorld's always talked about how great they are at breeding animals. I mean, they do a great job with dolphins, but they're not doing such a great job with the beluga whales. That's why they need to bring more in. So I would say, okay, this is a failed experiment. We need to stop doing this. We need to, put the animals that are at SeaWorld on birth control. If we can, get them out of the tanks, put them in some, a better environment, put them in a, some sort of open ocean pool. With belugas, it's interesting because the water that they're in at SeaWorld is too warm for them. I mean, in general, these are Arctic animals. Mm-hmm. So, and at the Whale and Dolphin Stadium, the water temperature, they said it was in the 60s, but on a hot day in the summer, it could get up to 72 degrees easily. So the only time they're in even moderately warmer water than, I'd say like 32 to 40 degrees is probably during breeding time when they're in more shallow water. Otherwise, they're in much colder water. So that's incredibly stressful for them. So it's like SeaWorld's not meeting even their most base needs. So I don't.
Is that in any way part of the ability to bring in an animal, like having a good record of actual animal care within the captivity?
Yeah, and that's a larger issue because APHIS, the organization that regulates this whole thing, I mean, SeaWorld meets and exceeds their minimum standards for captivity, and they meet and exceed the minimum standards for the Marine Mammal Protection Act and according to National Marine Fisheries Service. They meet that. Those standards are so low though. So they can say, well, we are the best in the industry, but honestly, that's not saying much. I mean, maybe SeaWorld is the best in the industry, but for what these animals actually need, they're not providing them what they need.
So, I guess, would you wrap that into a way that says, ultimately, you went and testified against this?
Yeah.
So, what would you like to see happen at this point? What do you think is the best outcome?
Well, the best outcome would be that the permit doesn't get issued. I don't believe that's what's going to happen. My guess is that the permit will be issued and likely animals will get sick, if not die, either during the transport or, in the month or two after the transport. And, likely if the permit goes through, then probably an NGO, non-government organization like the Humane Society of the U.S. will sue to say that, well, you should not have issued this permit and here's the reasons why. And then NOAA will have to actually look at that information and say, well, do we need to go back and change this, or are we going to go with it and issue the permit? So there'll be some back and forth. But ultimately, my hope would be that the permit did not get issued and that we say, that the U.S. makes a strong statement. We do not condone taking more animals from the wild, and we are not going to support the Russians in capturing these animals from the wild. And then we can take that to a place like China and say, hey, this is not ethical anymore. We do not want to be doing this. We don't want to be teaching our kids that this is okay. So that's how I'd like to see it end up. But
is there anything that we can do?
Well, you can. Right now, this is the permit period is open for comment. So you can, if you just Google Georgia Aquarium NOAA import permit Russian belugas, you'll be taken to a site, and I believe there's over 4,000 comments right now, which is unprecedented on this permit. So you will be taken to a site where you can voice your opinion. And if you want to learn more, you can go to our site, Voice of the Orcas. You can go there. There's also the Orca Project. There's a lot of information out on the web. Like I said, Tim Zimmerman's blog has information that you can actually see what it looks like when belugas are captured. And you can go and write a letter and just submit your comment. And if it's not a form letter, if it's a well thought out comment, NOAA actually has to read it and they have to respond to it. And anybody who's interested can certainly send us an email at Voice of the Orcas, and I can send you some talking points from the Humane Society and some of the other information that came out of the hearing, so you can put together a good statement for them. But the more people that speak against the permit, NOAA will have more information. Unfortunately, they're bureaucrats. They only can decide yes or no. This isn't about changing the law. It's just about deciding whether or not the standards are being met based on this, whether the permit, whether the standards are being met for this import or not. It's not whether or not animals in captivity are okay. It's basically, are they meeting the standards for this permit or are they not?
But if they don't give it, they might be able to modify permits in the future to reflect some of those.
Yeah, we have no idea, but this is one step that we can take to stop this action.
Karen and Sam,
thank you.
I would like to thank both of you for filling us in on the beluga situation, and thanks for all the information, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That was great.
Yep.